Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers from right to left. Kara Scoggin, who you will be hearing from later today, is the Senior Communications Manager of Stanford Center for Professional Development, responsible for advancing student engagement inside and outside of Stanford. Today's featured presenters are Kenji Hakuta, Jeff Zwiers, and Sara Rutherford-quach. Sara, a former bilingual elementary teacher, has more than 13 years of experience working with linguistically diverse students and their teachers and has conducted extensive research on instructional practices for English learners. Sara was previously awarded a National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellowship for her work on the role of silence and speech in an elementary classroom, serving language minority students. Her areas of interest include classroom discourse and interaction analysis, language, culture, and instruction in multilingual and multicultural educational environments, institutional policy and curricular change, and educational equity. Sara has been involved with the design and teaching of more than 20 MOOC offerings since 2013, and she has also directed the development of many learning modules with the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium and the ELPA 21 Consortium. Jeff has worked for more than 15 years as a professional developer and instructional mentor in urban school settings, emphasizing the development of literacy thinking and academic language for linguistically and culturally diverse students. He has published books and articles on reading, thinking, and academic language. His most recent book is Academic Conversations, classroom talk that fosters critical thinking and content understandings. His current work at the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching focuses on developing teachers' core practices for teaching academic language, comprehension of complex texts, and oral communication skills across subject areas. And Kenji Hakuta is active in education policy. He has testified to Congress and courts on language policy, the education of language minority students, affirmative action in higher education, and improvement of quality in educational research. Kenji is an elected member of the National Academy of Education, a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, recognized for his accomplishments in linguistics and language sciences. He has served on the board of various organizations, including the Educational Testing Service, the Spencer Foundation, and the New Teacher Center. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Kenji.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time on a nice summer day to join us today for our presentation about the course that we'll be offering, Rich Talk Equals Rich Learning. And I'm pleased to be opening up this presentation with my colleagues Jeff Zwiers and Sara Rutherford-quach. To begin, I'd like to view a video of a classroom, an ELD, or an English Language Development, or in parts of the country it's called English as a Second Language or English as a New Language class, of fourth grade students who are having a conversation, having just read The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. And after reading, students are discussing as a prompt whether the wolf was guilty or not. And so I'm going to play this video.
The big bad wolf is not guilty because he was baking a cake for his grandma and he had a really bad cold and he blown the house down by accident because he had a cold.
So what you're saying is that the big bad wolf isn't guilty because he was trying to make a cake for his grandma and he had a really bad cold and he needed sugar to go get, and he accidentally sneezed down the houses because he had a cold.
Yeah. That was what I was saying.
The big bad wolf is guilty because what if he sneezed on purpose, and what if the pigs weren't dead when he sneezed down the house, and he made up his own story, and he made it all planned.
So what you're saying is that the big bad wolf is guilty because he might have sneezed on purpose and blown the house down on purpose, and the pages are on purpose. Can you speak?
What I mean is he's doing it on purpose because I think he made his own story. He planned his own story to make all the Big Bad Wolf thingy alive.
So you're saying is that he made up the whole story, so he doesn't want to go to jail.
So now, just having watched that video, let's just talk about why the role of rich talk and rich learning in this conversation that we just observed, and ask really questions about the fundamental role of language in classroom and as students learn. One is that students are wired to interact, that they are really the role that language plays is in facilitating interaction. But what you really saw in the video was two students who were really interacting about the prompt of whether the big bad wolf was guilty or not, why or why not, sharing ideas and so forth. And it's something that you hope to see in a lot of classrooms, and that's why we showed it. And this is really the purpose of the course, is to try to promote instructional strategies for supporting students being able to engage and interact in this way. And one of the things we hope to show you in the video, and those of you who saw it probably witnessed this, might think back to the video and saying, okay, and you know, this is really what language is about for kids. It's not about repeating vocabulary words. It's not about struggling to find the correct tense on a verb. It really is about interacting and engaging with others. Another question you might ask of this video, if you had to think about this, was, you know, were there opportunities for students to think on their feet? Conversation is not about scripted going back and forth, reading sentences, but it really is about spontaneous listening to others, thinking about what the others said, and trying to formulate your own ideas relative to what the other person said. And it is a live animal, so to speak. It's also an opportunity to try out ideas you know, a conversation is wonderful because not everything is transcribed, and you're not held accountable for it except during the immediate moment. So it's a great time to try out ideas. What do you think about this? Or this is what I'm thinking, and so forth. So that spontaneity in trying out ideas is another important component of conversations. Another is around clarifying ideas. And sometimes others will help you because they'll say, I'm not quite sure what you said there, or is this what you mean? And that allows you to sharpen your own thinking just by sort of putting the words out there. Conversation is also another way in which you can try to support your ideas. Ideas are complex. They are, you know, whether you're guilty or not is a complex idea. You may find multiple ways to try to support that. And so these are the sorts of things that at least those of you who saw the video probably saw the students struggling with. A lot of this is around language being, you know, it's a biological thing. It's something that's alive. It's spontaneous. It's creative. And these are the kinds of elements of conversation. And I'm going to ask Sara and Jeff if you might want to comment on some of what you might have seen in the video.
This is Jeff. I'd like to zoom in on clarifying ideas. What you will see, or what you might have seen in the video, is a lot of paraphrasing. And paraphrasing, even though it seems like it's just repeating things, it's a powerful way for kids to both get feedback on how clear their ideas are, but it's also a way to build language. As I clarify your idea, as I paraphrase your idea, I'm practicing with the language. So it's an authentic way to practice language when you're in a conversation with others.
Sara, you want to add anything to that? we're having a conversation here, by the way. And so, and it really is about how we develop content, foster thinking, and develop language.
The one thing I want to add, and this kind of encompasses all of this, is that all of these things, or even conversation moves, or trying to get students to paraphrase, you can try these things out, but at the heart of it, if your classroom is does not have a culture where it's okay to make mistakes, and it's okay to say things that aren't exactly, the polished final result, then a lot of these things will be difficult. And so one of the things that we're trying to do in this course and in this webinar is that we're trying to build a culture of conversation, but also a culture where knowledge is something that's generated throughout time. And you don't just ask and answer questions, that you ask a question and they come back with an answer. So the idea of conversations is that they're building towards an answer and they're working on it. And so that's one of the things that if that's not there, then all of these different points are hard to do. So I wanted to make sure that we mention that as we move on, because that's kind of at the heart of what this building a culture of classroom conversation is.
Great, thank you. And this really, the idea of conversation as being the way in which content, thinking, and language come together. I think of them as sort of a macrame or a blending together of these is really what we're hoping to promote in this course. And the context for this work, and Sara and Jeff and I and others on our team have been working for the last 3 years now, offering free online courses, MOOCs, experimenting around with this idea. And part of what motivated us to do this work was because of the shifts in standards that were going on around the country. Some of them are called the Common Core in English Language Arts and Math. Many states call them college and career ready standards. But all of them are really related standards in that they're really trying to promote deeper, more rigorous uses of language in the course of learning English language arts skills as well as mathematical skills, and in states that have adopted the next generation science standards or similar variations on science. A lot of them require collaborative language. They require argumentation. They require engagement and explanation of one's reasoning around complex texts and so forth. And so that's what we're trying to gain. And a lot of the shifts really require a move from thinking about the language being used as an individual accumulating of the right answers, paying for points, or playing school, and rather the actual engagement with language in the course of collaborative conversations that are happening. And so what we want to see is less of this kind of formulaic, repetitive kinds of uses of language, and more around collaborating, understanding, building, using, and communicating whole ideas. That these new requirements for how we should really think about engaging students in rigorous content that's supported by the shifts in the standards towards college career-ready standards really requires this kind of more organic, more rich, collaborative, dyadic, or group conversational uses of language. So I'm going to now shift this over to Jeff, who is going to elaborate further on what we'll be doing in this course.
Jeff here, and I want to start off with looking at, there are a lot of, I would say, fake or inauthentic conversations out there. And here's a nice quotation by a philosopher, I believe. The more genuine conversation is, the less its conduct lies within the will of either partner. A conversation has a spirit of its own, and the language in which it's conducted bears its own truth within it. That is, it allows something to emerge which henceforth exists. So in a conversation, two people bring their ideas, but they're not just memorized and they're not just one person sharing their idea with the other. They build something. And so that's what we're trying to get at in the classroom, is how can students work with each other to construct ideas in conversation. But as Sara alluded to earlier, we also have to foster some conversational mindsets in our students. It's not just teachers doing things. It's also students need to unlearn a few things and need to learn that conversation and working with others can be a powerful way to learn many things. And so, here's a semi-humorous slide, although there's a non-humorous element to it. If you look at it, what we'd like kids is each time a topic is introduced, for example, today we'll begin our unit on the American Revolution. Every student thinks, and this is where you can start laughing if you want, but I can't wait to share my ideas and hear those of others. You're probably thinking, how many students actually think that? And then I'll learn to remember this better by talking about it. Now, there might be a certain few kids that might think that because they like to talk, but we're not as concerned about those kids. I like it when partners push me to think, build, and clarify. Yeah, I'm not sure how many kids I know. And I'm open to changing my mind and learning new ideas from others. And so these types of mindsets, make up the culture of conversation and the culture of learning through conversation. Actually, if you look at this, I sometimes wonder how many adults in different settings have these. And what we want our students to grow up into adults that also have these types of mindsets, right? That they're not just individual, competing with others, and just learning on my own. And so that's one of the things that we try to emphasize in our work. Let's look at another important area is looking at the prompts. This has come up in our ongoing research that we do with teachers related to our online courses and other work. And we found that there's a big struggle to come up with effective prompts. And so a couple things that we'd like to, we'll cover briefly here. One is having a purpose for conversing. A lot of kids and adults don't often know why they're talking and don't have a solid purpose or direction. There's also, the prompt should require thinking and doing something with ideas. So not just regurgitating, but actually transforming ideas in some way, transforming, fortifying, that kind of thing. And then finally, they should encourage students to share novel ideas and learn from one another. Like we said earlier, it's not just I'm sharing my wisdom with you and you're just agreeing and nodding your head. So there's a building. I bring some materials to the conversation. You bring some materials, and then we both construct something that we couldn't have done on our own. And now let's look at some prompts and see if some sample prompts, and we'll see how these do. What's the most important theme for fourth graders in this story? Does that hit all the boxes here? If there is a purpose. I might have a different idea than you. They require thinking, definitely this type of interpretive thinking, and each kid might have a novel idea. Even if they have the same theme in their mind as they come to the conversation, there's different reasons for it and different ways of expressing it. Often there's going to be different evidence for it. How about what conclusions can we make about animal adaptations based on this evidence? So it's kind of a science prompt. Does it have a purpose? Yes. Does it require thinking? Yes. Does it encourage students to share novel ideas? In most cases, students will be able to share novel ideas and have them kind of synthesize and combine together. How about collaborate to create a real-world word problem that requires both adding and subtracting of fractions? So this also, there's a purpose. They're constructing something. It requires thinking because they have to apply some of the thinking that they've been doing in other probably similar problems, and it encourages them to share some novel ideas about what kind of problem we're going to create together. And then finally, another example would be was Christopher Columbus a hero or not? And this is a common topic in a lot of schools. And what I'd like to do is, does this have a purpose? Yes. Does it require thinking? And does it encourage students to share novel ideas? And what I'd like to do is look at these. Well, let's see if the prompt actually works with this little snippet of a conversation. Okay, so it's the same prompt. I don't think Columbus was a hero. Why not? Because he hurt them and made them to be slaves. But he helped Spain get rich and he found America. So he hurt them. Heroes don't hurt or make slaves. Maybe, but he was brave to keep sailing. He had maps, and he met a Portuguese guy. That guy should be famous, not Columbus. Okay? So did the prompt work? And that's one of the questions that we want to continue to ask as we work with conversations, because conversations are extremely messy, especially paired conversations. You have 15 to whatever conversations going on simultaneously. It's messy business. It's loud, and you can only listen to a few at a time when you're in the classroom. So we have to really get our prompts right, and that's one of the things that we try to work on, is how can we come up with prompts. Of course, there's a lot that leads into that prompt as well. There's a lot of things that kids need to learn, like about the Portuguese guy. But we want kids to learn things and then be able to share them in these conversations, because it's almost like a foundry where they're adding things and they're coming up with new things. They're adding their own ideas, and then they're coming up with new things in this foundry of conversation. And I think I'm going to pass it on now. We're going to dig in even more deeply to look at the formative assessment of conversation. I'm going to pass it on to Sara now.
Okay, so this is a great segue, because we talked a little bit about prompts and how forming a thoughtful prompt that engenders conversation is really important, and not necessarily a prompt that just asks for a single answer or a series of answers. But that is important, but only when paired with a formative assessment of conversations. And what we mean by that is basically listening to current student conversations, where your students are right now, or if it's the summer, where other students are right now, and then thinking about where you'd like them to be. So a lot of you, and when I was a teacher, I did turn-in talks, right? So I taught kindergarten and first grade, and I would have the kids turn to each other and talk all the time, probably 2 or 3, 4 times on the carpet while we were there. But I didn't necessarily know what they were all saying, and I couldn't, because, there was one of me and 20 different kids, so there's 10 different conversations going on, or so I hope there's 10 different conversations going on. So one thing that we really advocate for is actually focusing in on 1 or 2 conversations, recording those conversations, and listening to the recording and transcribing it so that you can really tell what kids are saying. So one thing we've learned from that is a lot of times when we think kids are saying a certain thing, we think students are conversing in a certain way, even when we're hearing them, when we record the conversations and we listen back to it, that's not actually what happened. And so actually listening and paying very close attention to where students are currently in their conversations is really important, so that you can get them to where you would like them to be. And we've created a tool, if I can get this, called the Conversation Analysis Tool, that will help you formatively assess conversations. And this, as you see here on this slide, there's dimension 0, dimension 1, and dimension 2. So I'm going to talk about dimension 1 and dimension 2 first, because these are the first 2 dimensions that we created. So there's only two main dimensions here, and we've kept it simple on purpose because we want you to be very focused on these things. And we found them to be the most important in building up a conversation. So dimension 1, turns build on previous turns to build up an idea. And by a turn, we mean when one person is talking. So if Jeff and I were having a conversation right now, I would say, hey, Jeff, how are you doing? And that would be one turn. And Jeff may answer me, and then that would be a second turn. That was his turn. So dimension 1, we say, Jeff and I's turns, we build on each other so that we build up an idea over time. So say our question was the prompt that we had before, was Columbus a hero? And so I may say, I don't think Columbus is a hero, and Jeff may ask me, why do you not think that? But it's not unless it's over time to build up an idea about whether Columbus is or is not a hero. And then, so that's the first one, build up on turns build on each other to build up an idea. And then dimension 2 is turns focus on the content or skills related to the lesson's objectives. So this is not anything new for educators. Basically, we want to make sure that students are actually talking about the prompts. They're addressing the prompts. As an early elementary teacher, this would happen a lot. We'd ask a question about, so what did Tommy do at that birthday party? And the kids would go off on, I had a birthday party last week and I got cake. And so that's sort of, you know, in the realm of birthday parties, but it's not actually addressing the prompt. So dimension 2 is, are they actually addressing that? And one thing that that teachers that we work with in the past have found is when we're focusing on that, a lot of times we have ahas and realize sometimes that our prompts that we're crafting don't necessarily match the objectives that we had. So by looking very closely at this, you can see where is the match between the prompt and the objective and the student's conversation. So that's dimension 1 and dimension 2. So dimension 0 is students take appropriate turns. Now we added this dimension, and this is an optional dimension, but we added it in here after getting feedback from specifically early elementary teachers, kindergarten, first, second graders, pre-K teachers who are saying, these dimensions are great, but my students aren't there yet. They're still practicing how to actually take turns with each other. And so let's say, and I have 2 young children, so I can see this in practice as well. So I take a turn, you take a turn. And so a lot of times, particularly when you're asking them to address a particular academic subject or a prompt, kids may talk over each other. One person may talk and do all of the talking. The other person doesn't respond. So dimension 0 basically looks at whether or not they're taking turns. So this is a conversation analysis tool. We are going to keep that in mind now. We're just going to focus on, well, actually we'll do all 3 dimensions, dimension 0, dimension 1, and dimension 2. And let's take a look at some sample conversations. And I'm going to ask my colleagues, Jeff and Kenji, to join me here, where we're going to look at 2 conversations, one from a 4th grade class and one from, I think, a 1st grade class. This is the 1st grade one first. And we're going to go back and we're going to look at the conversation, and then we're going to try to formatively assess it based on the conversation analysis tool, just to give you an idea of how it works. So maybe, Jeff, can you read this conversation with me? I'll be A. I think, and we don't know the prompt. Do you know the prompt?
I think it was, should the main character have shared the bread at the end or not?
Oh, okay, and this is about the little red hen, right? Okay.
And just even before that, a quick little quiz. What were the dimensions again of the conversation analysis tool? Because as we read this, it's probably not in front of you right now. What was dimension 0? Remember?
Can I answer, Joe?
Yeah.
Oh. Dimension 0 is are the students taking turns?
Dimension 1?
I let Kenji.
Did they build on each other?
Yeah.
Did the turns build on each other?
To build up an idea.
Build up an idea.
And number 3?
Did the turns address the lesson's objectives? And it's not written in there, the prompt, but basically the objectives of the content.
Focus on the content. Okay, good. Just a quick reminder. Okay. A on B.
Okay, and this is a little red hen.
We passed.
Okay. I think she not share it.
Why?
Because the other animals not work. They're just lazy.
Yeah, I don't think they share it too.
Why?
Like my dad. He worked for money, not work, no money.
Yeah, no es justo.
Not fair, but teacher said it's good to share.
I share when they help. Maybe I paint the school. It's my money, you know.
No, maybe if no pueden trabajar, like they're sick, maybe. But this story, animals are lazy.
It's good to share, but not all the time. Not with the lazies. Okay, so as you can see, this
they did take turns.
They did. So, and we didn't show you basically, there's different categories. So if there's no evidence of taking turns, then you might say there's no evidence. If there's strong evidence, then you'd say there's strong evidence. A couple things that we want to stress before we actually look at dimensions 1 and 2 is the conversation analysis tool is not a grading tool. It's not a summative tool. It's basically for formative assessment. It's to help you see where your students are so you can get there. But it's not for students to get a grade. It's for you and for them to figure out how you can help them move forward. The second thing is the conversation analysis tool is for 2 people. It's not for 1 person. So I'm not going to go to student A and say, student A did a great job of taking turns, did a great. It's them together as a unit. And that's because conversations can't happen with 1 person. And we also want to try to really, really advocate for not using this as a grading tool. And it's harder to use it as a grading tool if you're using 2 people rather than 1. Okay, that's my spiel. So you think, Kenji, that they were taking turns?
Well, they did take turns.
Yep. Okay, what about dimension 1? Dimension 1 is turns build on each other in order to build up an idea.
Yeah, I would agree that they weren't just popcorning ideas around, and the turns definitely connected to one another. And an idea was built up at the end. I think the idea of not sharing with lazies.
Yeah, we have to remember this is a little red hen, right? And so if we had the tool in front of us that had the more detailed dimensions and the different categories of each dimension, like no evidence all the way up to strong evidence, this may be somewhere in between strong evidence and the category that's a little bit below that.
Yeah, for content, I think it would work too for the dimension 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's great.
And one more thing is that these are first graders who are just, they're bilingual students who are their English is starting to emerge. And one thing we want to point out is you can see there's a lot of like quote-unquote grammatical errors in this. That does not matter for the conversation analysis tool. We are not measuring whether they have, again, quote-unquote perfect English, because what we're measuring is whether or not they're building on each other and building up a conversation and building up knowledge together, which doesn't require total acquisition of the language. Okay. And this is a 4th grade science lesson. And Jeff, can you give us the prompt for this one?
Yeah, it's how do animals evolve.
Oh, there you go. It's right there. Okay.
Who's on the board?
Okay, so I'll be Elia. Okay. So how do animals evolve?
To live.
What's an example?
Sharks.
What's another example?
Turtles.
What's another example?
Giraffes. They got long necks.
Why?
To reach up into trees.
Okay, let's write these down. Oop. So let's do a quick assessment of that. How about dimension 0? Were they taking turns? Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah. It goes student A, student B, Elia, and then Alex.
Yeah, there definitely is the turn taking, and then you get to dimension 1. Then you start talking about, well, are they really building up something? They're building on one another's ideas, sort of, but they're not really building up anything yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're not randomly saying things, right? But they're not building an up idea together. They're more making a list.
There's a little potential at the end with that they got long necks to reach up into trees, right? So they're kind of getting there. But and this is an important point. Sometimes it does take a while in a conversation for kids to actually get to kids and adults to actually get to, oh yeah, we are building something. There are some ideas we can talk about, right? So there's a little warm up.
Yep. And this conversation a little bit models what the teachers might be asking a whole class. A series of questions and then answers sort of rotating around students.
And yet, we do want students to become more like teachers in some respects. If you look at Alex's to live, that wouldn't be enough for a teacher. If a teacher was listening to that answer, a teacher would say, okay, well, can you explain what that means? And also with the sharks example, a teacher wouldn't say, what's another example? A teacher would say, please elaborate how sharks answers this question, right? So there would be more pushing from the teacher, which is what we want students to do. We want students to be kind of like little mini teachers out in the classroom that elicit lots more language out of students than what normally happens, between students.
Okay. So dimension one, as far as building up, so our consensus is that we don't really feel like there's a lot of building up here. A little bit of potential at the bottom, but not a strong evidence of it. What about dimension two? Do the turns address the content or the objectives? So the prompt again was, so how do animals evolve?
I mean, it's not way off base. They have some examples that in their heads, I think they do have. They're not explaining it, which is what we want. Exactly. But I think they're definitely, they're definitely getting there. Yeah. So I would say, whatever the level would be, some evidence. In the middle, yeah, some evidence. Lots to work with. Yeah. So another thing we want to point out is that the syntax of these examples, this fourth grade example, is perfect, right? The questions are articulated in a way that would be stereotypically grammatically correct, but that does not matter because this actually shows more evidence. The first grade example shows more evidence of building on each other to build up an idea and conversation than the fourth grade example does. So this is how this tool is a little bit different than things that you may have used in the past. Okay, so I think this is our last slide before we open it up a bit. And so as we move forward, and as you move forward for preparing for formative assessment of conversations in your classrooms come this fall, there are a few things that you can do to get ready for this if you take on this challenge. The first thing is look at the big ideas in each unit to draft conversation prompts. So I know one thing that I was guilty of as a classroom teacher is I would wait till I get right in front of the students to think about prompts, and then I would ask them to turn and talk, and I would just, pose a question. But I wouldn't really put a lot of time and energy into developing these prompts ahead of time. So a lot of times my on-the-fly questions didn't actually engender the type of conversations I was looking for. So that's one, and then here's 2 and 3. Think about what you want to see. So if you were asking a question about Columbus, what sort of conversations would you want to see in an ideal situation? And then write those down. It actually helps for you to envision what the conversations or the model conversations would be. And then I would say, when time comes, share those with the students too. Number 3 is practice with the conversation analysis tool. So that's the tool that we just demonstrated with. It's called the conversation analysis tool. It has 2 required dimensions and 1 optional dimension. And you won't be able to practice with your own students because you're not in school right now unless you're in year-round. But we have samples conversations that you can practice with until then. And then 4, write model conversations that show features. This is kind of an extension of number 2, right? Thinking about what you want to see and then you actually write it down. And number 5, start assessing the first month of school and have students self and peer assess. And so again, this is start formatively assessing, or start the process of formatively assessing conversations during the first month of school and involve students in that process. So look at model conversations together, record their own conversations, have the students listen to their own conversations, and then they can have an idea of what you're looking for, and so they can move closer to that. Okay. And then I'm going to open it up to final thoughts from Jeff and Kenji before we address any questions that are lingering. Well, that was a lot in a little compact space, but we hope that it has given you, and we'll probably answer some questions here as well, but we hope that it's giving you I'd say some inspiration and some kind of interest in trying some of these things out, because one of the things that we've also encountered is it takes time and patience and lots of trials to get these things going in the classroom. If you just try it once, twice, even for a month or 2, it doesn't really get going until maybe half a year. Some teachers will say, oh no, it took me a year or 2 to actually understand how to get kids conversing and how to build their conversation skills. So it's really a, the question often comes up: is this worth the time? Is it worth the time? Most people on this webinar are probably interested in it enough to think it's worth the time. But in the larger swath of districts and schools, there's a lot of people. We're still doing kind of this traditional memorize the stuff, take a test, pay for my points with my facts, and that's it. And there's a lot of that traditional. And so this is a major overhaul, as Kenji alluded to in the beginning. And so, thinking about we have to think about and really listen into kids' conversations, valuing what they have to say, valuing their voices, but also at the same time thinking how is this useful for learning of content, of learning of language, learning of thinking skills, and social skills. One of the other things that's often missing in a lot of kids is just the ability to have good conversations with a wide range of others. So, I'm hoping that some of this stuff will come out in the future, as we work through this.
I'd like to just share that during the past few years of doing this work, we've heard from lots of districts who have been using these tools, and that there's tremendous variation out there in how much the orientation towards conversation as a form of academic learning is sort of integrated or becoming sort of a district-wide as a culture. And for some, you see it more in certain subject areas than in others. English language arts more than in math. Others, you see more of it. And so there are these pockets of kind of cultural changes for a culture of conversation that's happening, but that I just want to acknowledge that that many of you will be in districts with different in different kinds of settings. The other thing I would like to share is just that we kind of started this workout thinking about supporting English language learners, but as we've done this work and seen the responses to it, a lot of the realization is that this really is you might think of English language learners as being the tip of the iceberg or the canary in the mine or whatever. These are students for whom this kind of engagement with language is necessary for English language development, but it's really a form of learning for all students. And so the uptake of our work has been not just among teachers who would consider themselves English language learners, but for all teachers who think of themselves as teachers primarily of core academic content.
Yep. Okay. Well, thank you, Kenji, Jeff, and Sara. This is Kara Scoggin now with the Stanford Center for Professional Development. And while we take a moment to prepare for the Q&A portion of today's webinar, we'd like to take a brief moment to tell you about the center. The Stanford Center for Professional Development makes it possible for today's best and brightest professionals to enroll in Stanford University courses and programs while they maintain their careers. This, of course, helps you to continue your education while advancing your career, organization, or in this case, your classroom. Most curriculum is delivered entirely online, and opportunities to take class at Stanford or at your work site are also available through the center. Basically, it's your access point to the teaching and research of Stanford. Starting this August, a 3-week online course taught by our presenters today, Kenji, Sara, and Jeff, will be made available. We're very excited about this. Effective Conversation in the Classroom is specifically designed to help you prepare for the new school year, a vital time for fostering a culture of productive and respectful communication. Enrollment for this course is open now and can be found at scpd.stanford.edu. You might also be interested in another course we have, How to Learn Math for Teachers. This course is also available entirely online and covers teaching strategies for increasing students' math motivation and achievement. Enrollment, again, can be found at scpd.stanford.edu. Now let's get started with our Q&A portion. We have some wonderful questions from our participants online. The first one being, how do students react when they know they're being recorded?
I was going to say it takes a little bit of time, I think, for students to feel fully comfortable when they're recorded. Oh, I'm muted. Sorry. Okay, I'm not muted now, right? Okay, so this is Sara, and I was going to say it takes a little bit of time for students to feel comfortable recorded, but we've done it in our classrooms for forever, and you know, I would say 2 or 3 days of doing this, depending on the student's age, and they just act like nothing's happening. We have typically used audio recording, and in our previous courses, that's what we have IRB or research permission for audio recording. There are also times where we use video recording, and we have a lot of video examples of students that you could see in this course if you sign up for it. Video is a little bit more tricky as far as students' reaction because they can visually see it more, but they still get used to it over time. If you start doing it when they're younger, I think it makes a big difference. And then it's not up here, but I saw one that was kind of related to it about is there any sort of app or have students use their phones to record and they send it to you? Different educators have done different things. We actually have a colleague who's working on an app that we could actually all use together. It's not completed yet, but hopefully in the next year or two it will be. But what most people have done now is the teacher has either recorded using her phone. You know, if you have a smartphone, it's very easy to do that. Just place the recording down on the table in between the students. I haven't heard of the students recording it and sending it to you, but I don't think there's any reason why they couldn't if they're older, obviously. I'm kind of old school, and I actually have a digital recorder that I use a lot of the time. I know some people have used iPads. Or their actual computer. The bigger you get, the bulkier it is, obviously. But the most important thing, no matter what you use, is that you actually can hear both of them. And so if you have 20 conversations going on in the room and you put the recorder on your desk, you're not really going to hear any of those conversations very well. So you want to put it as close to the students as you can get. Anyone else want to add anything?
Yeah, and there are more often than not, the students are more engaged in conversing because there's a little bit more accountability to it. They're not freaked out. They're not freaked out as much as the video. And so we've had, kids with their phones and actually call in and send their files up to the teacher, name them. And so there's different ways to do that, but I would say overall it's a good thing to get kids used to that and recording it. Even if you don't listen, which you can't listen to all of them, it is a way, you might listen to them. And that's more so than if you're not recorded at all and 2 kids are in the corner talking about the Friday night party.
Yeah.
So I would just say that as a quick answer.
I would just add one more thing around this recording of student conversation. Is that working? Around the recording of student conversation, which is that I know that many teachers around peer observation of each other's teaching feel a little uncomfortable sometimes sharing sort of observations of teacher practice, and that looking at each other's students' language practice really lowers the threshold for collaboration, that people feel much more comfortable having their students being, it's their students' behavior that's looked at, even though it really is the teacher and what the teacher does around good prompts and so forth that really supports good conversation, but that this is a really good tool to embed within a teacher collaboration community in schools.
Well, that kind of leads us into this next question. It sounds like that's a great piece of advice you're giving teachers, but one of our participants is curious, what advice would you give for high school teachers who are trying to increase and or improve the quantity and quality of whole class conversation?
Whole class.
One thing that I would emphasize and have emphasized is building some of the skills, the conversation skills that you want to see in paired conversations, just having, build that into the whole class conversations and having students take on some of the, like I said before, a little more of that teacher-like role. So instead of, when someone answers a question, always the teacher saying, well, can you support that from the text, pushing that out on the students and saying, okay, what do we say next? So really bringing the whole class kind of habits of conversation out onto them, because what they've been used to, especially before high school, and there's a lot of years of school, they've been used to the teacher directing all things conversation. And so changing that around and saying, you know what, you guys are going to do more of the direction of the conversation, and there's a few skills that you can work on, even as a whole class. For example, can you support that idea from the text? Can you clarify that? What do you mean by this? Even those things that teachers usually do are conversation skills that students can build in a whole class setting. And then, in addition to that, another important aspect is having a kind of clear prompt and direction for the classroom conversation, which often doesn't. Sometimes it's just, okay, I have discussion down on my lesson plan and that's it. But there isn't really a firm direction that you have for okay, well, what are we going to do with this 5-minute whole class discussion? Where do we, you never know exactly where you're going to be. You can't script everything. You don't know exactly, but at least you have, at least a default direction, because it can go all over the place. Anybody else?
I think that's a great answer.
Excellent. Well, our next question is, are there differences of what to listen for in terms of analysis of conversations when different disciplines, i.e. math, English, science, art, etc.? Are there sources for good prompts for different disciplines?
It's a good question.
It is a good question. And yes, I mean, the short answer is yes and no. Could you put the question right back up again so I can see it? When we created this conversation analysis tool, we did it as simple as we could so that it would apply across disciplines. And so conversing is an important skill across all disciplines. So at the very basic level, these 3 dimensions are going to be applicable in any grade level in any content area. But there is obviously going to be difference in the qualitative nature of the conversations depending on your grade level and on your content area. There's also going to be great differences in prompts. But as far as good sources for good prompts in different disciplines, I think, and Jeff may have more to add to this, but in my opinion, the most important source for creating a good prompt is your content. So you can't just, say, these are some good prompts for art or for environmental science, because your prompt has to connect very, very intimately to the content that you're addressing. There are ways to phrase questions so that they don't create, these one-word answers. But if your prompt doesn't connect intimately to the content you're addressing, then it's not worth much anyway. Do you guys want to add anything to it?
I mean, one good example is that math conversations are different from English conversations.
Yeah.
And how are they different? For example, one way of engaging in, maybe you'd call it supporting ideas in math, is not by referring to some example from a text, but rather using mathematical reasoning based on mathematical principles. So you're actually not looking for, oh, well, the teacher said this, or I found this in this book. You're actually looking for a mathematical explanation based on mathematical principles. That's just one example that might be different, whereas in English, you're looking for evidence from, let's say, the story. Or in history, you might be looking at evidence from a primary source document. And as Sarah said, sources for good prompts. Yeah, you can look. I mean, I definitely encourage people to look for good prompts and look for. In some cases, there will be good prompts in curriculum materials. One in the area of essential questions for a unit. That's often a decent place to start, and that's kind of what Sarah was saying too. Is there's often this big question. Well, that's something that we want kids to be able to talk about. And so that would be another place to at least find, what is the essential idea, turn that into a question, and it's probably going to be, a fairly decent prompt overall.
And this question of good prompts, I mean, we're doing research on it right now because it's a hard question. And so sometimes you'll think a prompt is great, and we'll think a prompt is great, and then it flops. And so it's a little bit of trial and error to see whether or not a certain type of question will lead to the conversations.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jeff, Sara, and Kenji for your time today, and everyone who joined us on the line. Again, this webinar is presented on behalf of their new course, Effective Conversation in the Classroom, available through the Stanford Center for Professional Development. Class starts August 2nd. It's available entirely online. We hope you'll join us. And thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.
Reading sentences, but it really is about spontaneous listening to others, thinking about what the others said, and trying to formulate your own ideas relative to what the other person said. And it is a live animal, so to speak. It's also an opportunity to try out ideas a conversation is wonderful because not everything is transcribed, and you're not held accountable for it except during the immediate moment. So it's a great time to try out ideas. What do you think about this? Or this is what I'm thinking, and so forth. So that spontaneity in trying out ideas is another important component of conversations. Another is around clarifying ideas, and sometimes others will help you because they'll say, I'm not quite sure what you said there, or is this what you mean? And that allows you to sharpen your own thinking just by sort of putting the words out there. Conversation is also another way in which you can try to support your ideas. Ideas are complex. They are, whether you're guilty or not is a complex idea. You may find multiple ways to try to support that. And so these are the sorts of things that at least those of you who saw the video probably saw the students struggling with. A lot of this is around language being it's a biological thing. It's something that's alive. It's spontaneous. It's creative. And these are the kinds of elements of conversation. And I'm going to ask Sara and Jeff if you might want to comment that there are in parts of the country it's called English as a Second Language or English as a New Language class of fourth grade students who are having a conversation, having just read The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. And after reading, students are discussing as a prompt whether the wolf was guilty or not. And so I'm going to play this video.
The big fat wolf is not guilty because he was baking a cake for his grandma and he had a really bad cold and he blown the house down by accident because he had a cold.
So what you're saying is that the big fat wolf isn't guilty because he was trying to make a cake for his grandma and he had a really bad cold and he needed sugar to go get. And he accidentally sneezed down the houses because he had a cold.
Yes. That was what I was saying.
The big bad wolf is guilty because what if he sneezed on purpose? And what if the pigs weren't dead when he sneezed down the house? And he made up his own story and he made it all planned.
So what you're saying is that the big bad wolf is guilty because he might have sneezed on purpose and blown the house down on purpose and ate the pigs on purpose.
Can you? What I mean is he's doing it on purpose because I think he made his own story. He planned his own story to make all the big bad wolf thingy alive.
So you're saying is that he made up the whole story, so he doesn't want to.
Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers from right to left. Kara Scoggin, who you will be hearing from later today, is the Senior Communications Manager of Stanford Center for Professional Development, responsible for advancing student engagement inside and outside of Stanford. Today's featured presenters are Kenji Hakuta, Jeff Zwiers, and Sara Rutherford-quach. Sara, a former bilingual elementary teacher, has more than 13 years of experience working with linguistically diverse students and their teachers and has conducted extensive research on instructional practices for English learners. Sara was previously awarded a National Academy of Education Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellowship for her work on the role of silence and speech in an elementary classroom, serving language minority students. Her areas of interest include classroom discourse and interaction analysis, language, culture, and instruction in multilingual and multicultural educational environments, institutional policy and curricular change, and educational equity. Sara has been involved with the design and teaching of more than 20 MOOC offerings since 2013, and she has also directed the development of many learning modules with the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium and the ELPA 21 Consortium. Jeff has worked for more than 15 years as a professional developer and instructional mentor in urban school settings, emphasizing the development of literacy, thinking, and academic language for linguistically and culturally diverse students. He has published books and articles.
Go to jail.
So now, just having watched that video, let's just talk about why the role of rich talk and rich learning in this conversation that we just observed, and ask really questions about the fundamental role of language in classroom and as students learn. One is that students are wired to interact, that they are really the role that language plays is in facilitating interaction. But what you really saw in the video was two students who were really interacting about the prompt of whether the big bad wolf was guilty or not, why or why not, sharing ideas and so forth. And it's something that you hope to see in a lot of classrooms, and that's why we showed it. And this is really the purpose of the course, is to try to promote instructional strategies for supporting students being able to engage and interact in this way. And one of the things we hope to show you in the video, and those of you who saw it probably witnessed this, might think back to the video and saying, okay, and you know, this is really what language is about for kids. It's not about repeating vocabulary words. It's not about struggling to find the correct tense on a verb. It really is about interacting and engaging with others. Another question you might ask of this video, if you had to think about this, was, you know, were there opportunities for students to think on their feet? Conversation is not about scripted going back and forth, reading.
On reading, thinking, and academic language. His most recent book is Academic Conversations, classroom talk that fosters critical thinking and content understandings. His current work at the Center to Support Excellence in Teaching focuses on developing teachers' core practices for teaching academic language, comprehension of complex texts, and oral communication skills across subject areas. And Kenji Hakuta is active in education policy. He has testified to Congress and courts on language policy, the education of language minority students, affirmative action in higher education, and improvement of quality in educational research. Kenji is an elected member of the National Academy of Education, a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, and a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, recognized for his accomplishments in linguistics and language sciences. He has served on the board of various organizations, including the Educational Testing Service, the Spencer Foundation, and the New Teacher Center. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to Kenji.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time on a nice summer day to join us today for our presentation about the course that we'll be offering, Rich Talk Equals Rich Learning. And I'm pleased to be opening up this presentation with my colleagues Jeff Zwiers and Sara Rutherford-quach. To begin, I'd like to view a video of a classroom, an ELD or an English language development